Hi everyone, you've got me, not Becky tonight, which is a change for a lot of you. Nice to see so many familiar names coming through the door. What will be happening is in a few minutes, I'll be handing you over to Nat. Nat is an independent artist who believes in printing himself so he can control the work from beginning to end and uses Epson products. But he's going to go through a lot of the processes that he uses. If you don't know him, he's based in the Midlands, not too far from where we are, to be honest. And what he's asking is, please post your questions, put them in the Q&A section, and we'll do them all at the end. Then there's a flow to what he's got to say. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nat and probably hide myself, if I'm truthful. And then obviously towards the end, we'll bring up the questions. Please use the chat to say hi to each other, but do put the questions in Q&A and not in the chat because I might miss them otherwise. Thank you very much, and over to you, Nat.
Thanks very much, Steve. If you would, Steve, just maybe stay close at hand, at least with your microphone mute button, just for a little bit, just to make sure that as I start sharing my screen, that everybody can see what I'm doing. And if there are any problems, if you can let me know, that would be helpful.
I'm going nowhere. I'm watching this all the way through.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Thanks for that nice introduction. And hello, everybody, and good evening. Big thanks to the Guild for inviting me to present, and also for Epson sponsoring this event. I've been working with Epson here in the UK for a number of years. I've been living here in the UK for about 10 years. And I've worked with Epson printers far, far longer than that. And so I was asked to come and talk about my workflow and how I produce fine art prints, and maybe talk a little bit about the new Epson printers, which have come out over the last few months. And I've got some examples we can look at and talk about workflow, and hopefully have enough time really to go through some settings and setting up print jobs in Lightroom and Photoshop. So I'm going to share my screen now. Most of my talk tonight is going to be sharing my computer screen, although I do have here behind me the SureColor SC-P900, which is the A2 size of the new series, the new lineup of printers from Epson. And I've been working with this for the last few weeks, and it's fantastic. So I will mention some things about this printer, but for the most part, we'll be looking at screen sharing. So let me just share my screen and then make sure I hide what needs hiding here. And we'll go into... Sorry, I left it on the wrong slide. A little bit of fast rewind there. So very quickly, I'm not going to spend too much time on myself here, but just so you know kind of where I'm coming from and kind of what led me to presenting on a topic like this today. I started my professional career working in print, mainly in litho and offset commercial printing, but very quickly started turning my focus towards digital printing in the early 90s. And this is before photographic printing was widespread as it is now. Over the years, I have done a lot of exhibitions. I produce my own exhibitions. I also produce shows for other artists and for galleries. And in the last couple of years, I've launched my own gallery in Leamington Spa. So I'm now an art dealer, as it were, but I also still keep, quite active in the production side. I mean, my background all along in my career has been on, as a production guy. And it's only more recently that I've started, more on the marketing and the exhibition, the front end of sales, as it were. I also do a lot of group workshops as well as private one-to-one training on all things photography, not just printing, but also shooting and processing. I've written a few Lightroom books, etc. So I am a big believer in print, and I've always kind of made my own prints. Every once in a while, I will work with a lab if they have a specialist product that I can't produce, or if I need to send files kind of far away, halfway around the world. But for the most part, when I can do my own printing, I always prefer to. And I'll explain a little bit more about why as we go along. I'm assuming that a lot of you in the audience do your own printing already. I'm also kind of assuming that there's a few who would like to, or maybe are just getting started in printing. So hopefully I'll have something for everyone. So just real quickly, a little bit more, my work. These are large format canvases. I do a lot of abstraction. These days, I do most printing my own work on canvas, although it wasn't always that way. I mean, I do work with all types of paper and media. So here's some different exhibitions in galleries and hotels and restaurants. I have done quite a lot of festivals, and if you're a photographer looking to get your work out into the marketplace and start selling it as decor, I can really enthusiastically recommend doing a few choicely selected festivals from time to time, because it's a good way to get your work in front of an audience. This is the Foxton Locks Festival. You can see inside the marquee on the grass. Real quick program overview for tonight. We're going to talk about goals for printing, and this should be pretty universal in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. I'm going to take you through my suggested workflow for printing. Obviously, workflow with every aspect of photography. This is something that there are some points that are a little bit more personal preference than others. But my workflow has evolved and been refined, over many, many years, based on real world applications. So I hope you'll find some new little tips. I'll talk a little bit about choosing media. And by media, I mean paper, canvas, and whatever is the material that you're printing on. And actually choosing your paper and media is one of the most artistic aspects of photographic printing. We definitely need to spend some time on color management. This is where, for most people, if there's problems, this is where things tend to fall down. So we'll make sure that at least you've got the basics, so you know how to deal with problems when they come up. I'll walk you through the basic setup of a printer, including installing the driver, which is a really crucial piece. And then all of these up to this point, this is kind of the first half. So it's about 45 minutes. And then in the second half, we'll talk about printing from Lightroom and Photoshop. I'll take you through a few specific examples, and then we'll look at the new Epson print layout software. Just grab a quick drink here. I'm always reminded when I'm talking sort of nonstop for 90 minutes or more that my voice tends to get a little bit creaky, so apologies in advance. So goals for printing. Obviously, the title of this talk, referring to maximum quality. In my view, if you can't get the best possible quality, then it's not worth doing, full stop. We also want to do things as quickly as possible. I'm not one to sort of add extra steps just for the sake of, nitpicking. We want to move through things as quickly as we can, but also while preserving the same quality throughout. We need to make sure that the workflow is non-destructive, and most of you would be familiar with this term. Non-destructive simply means that you're using methods in your workflow that allow you to go back to any point in time and redo things. If you change your mind, or you want to try something different, or if you find it's not working the way that you thought. And a non-destructive workflow essentially involves either using layers and masks and things like that in Photoshop, or working with something like Lightroom, where you're doing all of your edits are done in a database using metadata. And so with that parametric style of editing, you can go back to any point. I'll talk more about these two different ways of editing in a minute. In our workflow for printing, we want to make sure that the results are repeatable, especially if you have an image that you're printing multiple times, not all at once. For example, if you were to be lucky enough to sell a print to a customer at an art fair on a weekend, and you want to make another one of those, well, it maybe goes without saying that you want to make sure that the next print that you make is as good or better than the previous one. So repeatable results. You don't want to be reinventing the wheel every time. And this is one thing that when I work with other printers on refining their workflow and improving results, one of the things that is really maybe tricky for individual situations is defining a sequence of steps that you can do exactly the same way every single time, regardless of the image. Okay, and this is very important. You need a workflow that is reusable. That also, though, means that you want to see some improvement over time, right? That if the prints that you're making today, if you were to continue printing a year from now, 5-10 years into the future, you would hope that your work would continue to get better and the prints are better, sharper, more vibrant color, or more neutral black and white, as the case may be, right? So you want to be thinking improvement even when you may be quite satisfied with what you're getting for the moment. So reviewing a workflow. Now, by workflow, we simply mean just a sequence of steps. You're trying to get to a specific outcome. In this case, the outcome is a print. A workflow, again, is something that is personal. And what works for me, in some cases, might not make as much sense for you, or that maybe you have a way that you like to do some certain aspect. It's really important, though, especially with printing, because we're trying to get repeatable, consistent quality, that your workflow is sort of locked down. Now, there's always got to be room for improvement, and you need to be able to tweak and tinker and make things better, but you don't want to be doing it different every time, right? This is really where you'll cause a lot of problems, and the results will not be as good as they could be. So this is why it's a sequence of steps here, step 1, 2, 3, and so forth. Number one is when I refer to the master file, this is your original photograph that you've worked up in the computer. Everything we're talking about tonight is all in the digital darkroom, right? I mean, it's all on a computer, looking at it on a screen and doing your editing. Whatever camera you have and whatever format it's been captured, whether it was a RAW file or an original DNG or a JPEG or a TIFF, whatever is your original, when you start working on that and doing your edits, color correction, white balance, sharpening, local adjustments, all of the things that you would do to finish that file, that's your master file. It's really important that you work on your image up to the point where you can say, I'm happy with this, it's done effectively for the time being, I'm ready to print. That is your master file. Now, from this point forward, any other files that you're working with need to be derivative files. Now, that may mean saving a different copy for a certain size on a certain paper, on a certain printer, or it could also mean, for example, in Lightroom, just making a virtual copy. And this is one real significant advantage of working in Lightroom and other database type of editing software, is that you can make different derivative versions of the master while leaving the master intact. Really fundamental point that I want to make here. Whatever printing you're going to do, whatever is the printer and the size and the paper and the profiles, all of these other decisions that you're making, don't do any of that stuff on your master file, right? You need to be working with derivative files. If you're not using Lightroom and you use maybe Photoshop exclusively, unfortunately, this will mean making multiple copies and multiple files on disk. But whatever you do, you need to keep your master file preserved in its original state, and then all of your printing decisions, those are done on separate files. So as you are completing your master file and you're thinking about making a print, you are deciding on the size. Now, this is one of your very key decisions. Is it A4? Is it A1? Is it some arbitrary size, a 16:9 ratio panorama? whatever the size is, you need to have this in mind even as you're starting to work towards your derivative files. Now, then comes the point of choosing media. And I've got another section we're going to switch to in just a minute. We'll talk more about choosing the paper. But I would suggest that in a workflow, if we have a sequence of steps, that size probably comes before media for one main reason, and that is, unfortunately, not all media comes in all sizes, right? And certain materials like canvas, for example, are going to be much more readily available and much cheaper if you're printing, for example, on a big roll, right? So canvases, generally, you're thinking printing larger sizes. If you're printing A4, those could be any kind of sort of photo paper or fine art paper or, any other type of material. So think size first, and then what's the type of material that you want to put it on. Preparing your print files and these derivative copies I just talked about a minute ago, this is where you're actually prepping your file specifically for that print job. So another key point here, if, for example, let's say I have an image that I want to print big on a canvas today, and then 3 weeks from now I print it smaller on a sheet of photo paper, I'm going to be potentially producing separate derivative copies for those, spinning those off of the master file, right? So your derivative copies actually include things like the optimal sizing, sharpening, at the end of the workflow, print sharpening, any adjustments that you might make specifically for the paper or the type of media. And don't worry, we're not going to be only looking at, text slides with lists here. I've got plenty of samples to show you. We're going to work through each of these in just a minute. Soft proofing is one that may be optional, but maybe only after you've gained some experience. I really believe, especially when you're starting to make your own prints, that getting soft proofing as a habit is going to save you all kinds of trouble and disappointment potentially. But as you get more experience, the need for soft proofing actually goes down. I'll explain more about that in a minute. So after you've worked up your derivative files and done your initial soft proofing on screen, then we get into where you're actually going in and setting up the print job. You're doing your page setup, again, driven by the size of the paper, making your settings in the printer driver. And this is actually where some of the most crucial decisions are made. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about printer driver. Checking the printer setup. By this, I simply mean, have you done a nozzle check, a clean nozzle check? Do you have enough inks to print the job? Is your maintenance box or your maintenance tank, does it have enough capacity? All of these basic things, because take it from me, I've learned it the hard way that you do not want to be halfway through a big, important, potentially expensive print job and then run out of ink. Because in most printers, at least all the printers I've worked with, if you have to change an ink cartridge halfway through the print's ruined. Doesn't matter, how far it's gotten. So you got to check all your settings before you cue the print job. Okay, so that's our workflow. I've probably spent more time on each one of these than I needed to, because we are going to go through this in practice in Lightroom and Photoshop in just a minute. So let's talk about one of the fun parts, choosing media. I am a big believer that every photograph has its best potential partner in a paper, right? So when you're thinking about what's the best media to use for a given image, I'm trying to encourage you here to not try and find one standard paper and always only print on that paper. And working with a lot of camera clubs, and even doing, workshops and one-to-one, I mean, I do see this kind of a lot. People tend to find like their one favorite paper, and that's all they ever work with. Now, certain images are going to look better on one kind of paper or another. So, and I have some examples. We're going to switch over and look at some pictures in just a minute, but just let me set the stage here. Really highly glossy paper really is only suitable for certain types of pictures. These need to be, very smooth, sharp almost glossy photos, if you can imagine that, even, before you pair it with the paper. I'll show you some examples in a minute. Your best all-around type of paper surface, though, is going to be luster. If you're looking for one type of paper that's always going to work for most images, a luster paper with just a very sort of soft sheen to it really is going to work the best with the widest range of images. Now, matte and fine art papers, though, can really lift the quality of a printed image massively, more than you might expect. For certain images, printing on a fine art type of paper is absolutely going to give you the best result. As I mentioned earlier, I like printing on canvas a lot, especially because I do a lot of abstract photography that I like to print, very large. And canvas, a stretched canvas with or without a frame, really just works great for that. But there's certain types of photos, again, that work better for canvas than others. And then last but not least, we've got kind of a range of specialist options. You can get metallic photo paper, with a soft sheen. Hahnemühle makes a lovely one of those. Fabric, most inkjet printers, you can find some type of a silk fabric or some type of a flexible material that you can print on. Epson make a fantastic paper called Japanese kozo paper. And I should point out that for almost all of these types of paper that are listed here, Epson has a really exceptional solution for. Over the years, Epson have really made a real effort towards developing a lineup of paper that not only works the best with their printers, but that is really, really good quality paper to begin with. And some of these paper and media are proprietary, and they're very unique and specific to Epson. So you won't find the exact same product, rebranded and made for someone else. So I'm going to switch over now to look at some pictures, and I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. I'll just start with this one, partly because it's the first one up. This image would not look good at all on glossy for one very important reason, that the black will effectively turn into a mirror. When you put a heavy, solid black ink down on a very glossy paper, the reflections just kill it. So right away, I would be starting to think fine art paper, probably not canvas either, because the texture would be too obnoxious. You'd see the texture through the black and on the white areas. Maybe a fine art paper with just a very, very subtle texture to it. Okay, but not glossy for that one. So what is an image that would look really good on glossy? This one. This is the type of image that looks great on glossy, because you see when I said earlier about an image that's kind of a shiny picture to begin with. This has got a reflection, and with the water and the rainbow as well. The characteristic of this image really reproduces very, very well on a very high gloss paper, which, not all images would. How about another one for glossy? That one, this one would look amazing on glossy paper. Okay, but in general, I don't print very much on high gloss paper. Any one of these would look really good on a luster paper as well. Maybe this one on glossy paper. Okay, so I guess the main takeaway here is that if you have always just used a high gloss paper just out of habit, you might want to rethink that and start trying some different types of media. Now, Epson and a lot of the other paper manufacturers do make sample packs. So you can just get a whole bunch of different ones and try them out and print the same image on different papers. So for luster, a luster paper would work with almost any one of these types of images. Now, when we think about like a fine art paper, just make these a little bit bigger. A fine art paper, something like this, where the background is very high key and it's very light. There's just a very, very slight amount of ink that would go onto the paper. This one looks amazing on fine art paper because, again, the characteristics of the image sort of work hand in hand with the characteristics of the paper. And that's really what you're looking for. In terms of canvas, right? Maybe something like this would look great on canvas, because when you zoom in here, we've got these little, sorry, bear with me, all these little details, right? This looks great on canvas because the texture of the canvas actually sort of meshes and interweaves with the textures in the image. This one would also probably look really nice on a fine art paper. Again, though, I would not put this on glossy, because the glossiness of the paper would work sort of against the characteristics of the image. Okay, maybe this one could be on glossy. This one I generally print on a luster paper, though, because again, I don't want the reflection to interfere. Now, maybe this one on glossy could look amazing, because if it's got a little bit of a reflection to it in the print, then that actually goes along with the characteristics of the image. Okay, so choosing your paper with respect to what is the content of the image, and even whether it's color or black and white. I mean, I personally think that black and white images, or very sort of monochromatic images, something like this lends itself much more towards a matte or a fine art type of presentation than a slick kind of glossy paper. But again, there's vast kind of room for personal interpretation here, right? Here's one that would look good on canvas or fine art paper, again, because of the textures. Okay, so I think you got the basic idea there. We're going to come back in a minute and look at some of these and actually queue up some of these for printing. In the meantime, though, let's just jump back to our slides here. Sorry, I'm presenting all of this from Lightroom just to make it easy for me not to have to switch back and forth, but here I am switching anyway. Okay, so the problem that most printers encounter, and I have to say this problem comes up even people sending files to a lab. All photographers at one point or another who are having prints made are going to have a print come back or come out of their own machine that doesn't look like you thought it should, or, and you're not happy with it. It's too dark, or the color's wrong. You got to understand that in almost no case is this a problem with the actual printer. Okay. I have actually heard students and clients, people in my workshop say, I can't get a good print out of my printer. Maybe my printer's no good. If you've got any kind of late model Epson, especially, I mean, any of the printers that they've put out for photographers, and for photo printing over the past 10, 15 years, these are solid machines and they can make fantastic reproductions. The issue is all in software. And this is one of the other main takeaways for tonight's presentation, is that while the printer is sort of at the end of the chain of, that's where the print comes out, right, of the printer, and the printer is obviously the main thing doing the work, really all of the controls and all of the problems and all of your work happens in the computer, right? I mean, so getting good prints is very much about learning to use the software, and not only the your host application, Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever you're printing, not only that software, but also understanding the printer driver software. And so we're going to look at that in just a minute. So we don't have time really to get too deep into color management. I mean, we could talk all night about this topic in particular, but just so we're all kind of on the same page, color management exists to help you get reproducible color that is sort of predictable, right? It doesn't mean that it's going to fix problems, and it also doesn't mean that all of your prints are going to come out looking just like you want, once you get this all in place. That's not really the point here. Color management is a system inside your computer that's responsible for translating an image file through the print pipeline so that it comes out the printer as accurate as possible. Now, accurate maybe has some subjectivity, and maybe there's a little gray area of what does a perfectly accurate or correct print look like. But I can tell you for sure that in a digital image file, any given pixel has a numeric value, right? A pixel has a number to it. It has a known color. And what we're trying to do is get that color and that brightness to come out as close as possible to what is true and correct when it comes out the printer. This is what color management is for. Now, if you're printing yourself, you have a lot more control over the color management process. And there are ways that you can put key stages in place to ensure that what you see on the screen is going to look as close as possible to what comes out of the printer. If you are sending files off to a lab, you can only control so much, but you really need to control that amount. And you need to be working with a lab who has their color management really well locked down. Unfortunately, all labs are not the same. And there are plenty of labs operating day and night who are not following good color management protocol, and sending files to them for prints, unfortunately, is a bit of a gamble, because you don't really know what you're going to get. So this is one reason, again, why I prefer to do my own printing myself, because at least I know I can control it from one end to the other. So the solution for prints not coming out like you want, first and foremost, is calibrating your monitor. Now, this might seem sort of counterintuitive. You think, well, why is it called color management, and why are we using printer profiles, etc., if the problem actually is with your screen? Well, if we go back to what I said a minute ago, your image file, the photograph, is made of digital values for each of the pixels. What you see on the screen is going to determine your expectations, and it's going to drive your editing process. If you're brightening things up or darkening them or increasing the saturation, changing colors, but what you're seeing on screen is not correct, unfortunately, maybe it comes as a surprise, but a lot of times what comes out of the printer is actually closer to reality of what's in the image file than what you're seeing on screen. A key example is if your monitor is set very, very bright, like brighter than what is accurate and true, then what you're seeing on screen looks a lot brighter than it should, means that what comes out of the printer is going to look a lot darker, right? And then you think, gosh, this printer just prints too dark all the time. But it's not a problem with the printer. It's because your monitor is too bright. So you need to use a device to measure and calibrate and create a profile for your monitor. These are products from i1, or from X-Rite. This is the i1 series. X-Rite is the only color management company that I recommend for the profiling products. There are a few others out there, but none of them work as well as X-Rite. So the solution basically involves, as you can see in this image to the right here, putting the device on the screen, measuring it, creating a profile so that what you're seeing on screen is as close as possible to what is actually in each image file. Now, when I say as close as possible, you also have to understand that there are certain colors that may not be reproducible or may not be totally accurate on your monitor. And so that gets into discussions about the quality of your display. And you really do get what you pay for. And just as a general guide, for a good quality photographic display that you can expect to see accurate color when it's been profiled, you'd be spending £600-800 minimum. So if you're only spending a couple £100 on a monitor, you're going to have a very, very hard time getting accurate color out of that display, even when you use a calibrator like this. So you have to have a good monitor. You have to use an X-Rite system to profile it and calibrate it. you have to make sure that the brightness is set to the correct level. Now, when we talk about brightness, it helps to keep in mind that your monitor is emitting light, right? It's putting out light, it's transmitting. And so it's always going to be brighter than any sheet of paper, right? A sheet of paper is entirely, the brightness of it's entirely based on the ambient light and the reflected light from any light sources around it. So you're never going to get an exact one-to-one match from your screen to a print anyway, because they're two completely different animals. But surprisingly, you can get actually very, very close, especially if you're using daylight balanced or calibrated lighting, a lighting source. So if you calibrate and color balance your monitor, and then you've got good lighting that is sort of balanced the same as your screen, and you start to bring all these things into line, you'd be surprised at how quickly, right away, your prints start coming out looking a lot more like you thought they would. Now, that doesn't mean that you'd be happy with them, or that that they're as good as they could be, but we're starting from a place where at least you want to be able to know what it's going to look like when it comes out with some reasonable amount of certainty. And the only way to do that is to use color management. Okay, so that is the last of the slides. I'm going to switch back to the images, and we'll start going through some real world examples here. But first, I want to walk you through setting up the driver. I mentioned a minute ago how you have a few different bits of software involved here. Okay, so you have your imaging software, Lightroom, Photoshop, Capture One, Epson Print Layout, whatever is your program that you're printing from. That should, obviously be color managed so that you can trust what you see on the screen. And all of the Adobe products and the Epson products will give you an accurate color display. So you've got your host program where you're printing from. Well, it's also very important that you make the right settings in the printer software, right? And this is the driver that actually controls the printer itself. So with the P900, for example, it has its own driver. All printers have their own driver software, and these drivers are updated on a pretty regular basis. Even older printers. I've got an Epson over to my side here. I've got an Epson 9890, which, this printer is probably going on 15 years old by now, and it still runs like a champ. And they're still occasionally putting out new driver updates, right? So it's very, very important that you use the latest driver, and you have to use the Epson official driver software. So I'm going to show you real quickly the process of installing the driver for the P900. Now, I probably should clarify this before I get too far into this, that what I'm going to show you is going to be pretty much the same for any Epson printer, really for any printer for that matter. The sequence of steps, you need to download the software, install it, run through some basic options to add the printer into your system. And then from there, it's all in how you choose your settings in the driver when you're printing from your application. Okay, so we're going to go through all of this. Now, keep in mind, even if you don't have a P900, this is going to be still very relevant. Okay, so the first thing is to acquire the printer driver. Now, if you've just got the Epson P900, brand new, you've unboxed it, put it on your desk, and you're ready to go through the setup, there actually is a very, very automated sequence of steps that you can use to connect your computer with the printer and install the driver. So if you go to, there's a special web address here, and apologies, my Zoom bar is in front of my window. Let me just pull that down. Okay, if you see here, I actually initially went to epson.sn, okay? Now this is a new web address, new website for Epson, which is going forward, this is going to be where all the the more automated setups are going to be happening, right? So if you got a brand new printer, go to epson.sn, and then all you have to do is put in your printer model. So if I put in P900, you see it comes up right here, SC-P900. Click on that. Click on search. Welcome. Let's get started. Okay, so just go straight to setup. Now again, you have to be online. I haven't necessarily connected the printer yet, right? This is very early stage, but this is maybe something different to what you're used to, that when setting up a new printer, you're not getting a disk. Right? You're not installing something from a CD or a DVD onto your computer. You're using the internet. And because of that, you get some additional functionality where the website and the driver installer can communicate directly with the printer. So it'll recognize it, it'll see it, it'll know what it needs to do. So all of these routines are getting a lot smarter as time goes on. Whereas in the past, you'd have to, download each thing manually and run through the setups. It's now much more internet based, right? So preparing your printer, if you click, you can go through some basic videos that will, and this is not going to play well over Zoom, so I'm not going to really go through any of these too much, but you've got, setup videos for how to unbox and prepare the printer, blah, 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 blah. You go all the way to the end of these. Ready for the next stage. Okay, so we're still on epson.sn. Now, when we do the download, this literally is just downloading the software. And at that point, we're basically done with the internet. And now I've got the driver installer here in my downloads. And we can run through the installer, which will take longer than what we have. So let's just say I've opened the download and installed the driver. You just go through steps. You know how to install software. At that point, then, you need to actually add the printer. And this is where things get very important in the choices that you make. Okay, so the driver installer has put the Epson software in my operating system, and it's ready to add a printer. Now you can see I have the Epson P900 printer already installed here, but I can add another one. Okay, so let's pretend I don't have that one. So I do a new one. Okay, now during the the driver install process, there's a stage where it asks you to connect the printer. So it's already seen the printer, it knows that it's connected. The important thing is that when you're going to install the driver, and this goes not just for the P900, but for any Epson printer, that you want to be using a USB cable, right? Not Wi-Fi, even though this printer does support Wi-Fi, use a USB cable. And then when you have an option down here, I'm going to leave this on the screen for just a minute so everybody gets this. If you're using a Mac, you want to make sure to not ever use AirPrint. I really can't emphasize that enough. Apple and the Mac is going to try and really encourage you to use AirPrint to the point where it will actually automatically install the AirPrint driver if it just sees it plugged into the computer. If you ever open up your Epson printer control panel and you see that it's using AirPrint, you need to reinstall it, because we want to change it and use the Epson driver. This is the built-in Mac AirPrint driver, and if you use this, you're going to lose out on a whole bunch of different of options and settings, and you'll never get the quality that you want. So if you're using a Mac, do not use AirPrint. On Windows, it's a little bit more straightforward. It's going to assume that you want to use the Epson driver. Okay, so always, always, always check that. When I check, now it already exists, that's fine. Okay, so now I've got that the printer is added, and if I go into, look, I just double clicked on it to open the options, and already the Mac here is asking me, it's saying upgrade to AirPrint. it's not an upgrade. Don't do it. Never upgrade. We don't want AirPrint. It's not good for what we're trying to do with photo printing. Okay, so anytime you see an option for AirPrint, don't use it. Only use the Epson driver. Okay, now what we're looking at here is just the Epson print queue for this driver, this printer, and it's empty at the moment. Okay, so I'm just going to close out of that. So we've downloaded the software, we've unpacked it and installed the driver, we've added the actual printer, and now we're ready to print. Now, there's a couple other things that you may want to take note of. Again, if you're using Windows, some of these options are going to be in a different place, but they're all still there. Again, you want to make sure that it says that it's using the Epson driver. If it was AirPrint, it would say it right here. You can open the options and supplies panel. So this is all provided by the print driver. So this is telling you that the print driver is correctly installed. It is communicating with the printer. If I go over to supply levels, these ink levels are updated in real time. So we know that we have a successful driver installation, and we know that it's connected with the printer successfully, and they're communicating bidirectionally. And that is all there is to installing the driver. Now, the second bit of using the driver comes when we're actually setting up the print job using our software. And we're pretty much on time for that. Before we move into Lightroom and Photoshop, I did just want to spend one quick minute looking at printer profiles. Now, within the color management system, you have the printer driver, which controls the settings for the printer itself. But then you also have these other little bits of software called profiles. And a profile describes the printing characteristic of the printer itself and a certain paper. So Epson provide a whole bunch of different printer profiles along with the driver. And if you're using Epson Media and a recent model printer like the P900, then all of the profiles will be automatically installed and available. But if you're using some other Epson Media, or if you're using a third-party paper, you will need to acquire and install the correct profiles. Now keep in mind that a printer profile actually contains components not just for the printer itself, but also for the media, for the paper. So if you were using a third-party paper, you would go to that paper manufacturer to get the printer profiles for your printer model, okay? Epson have recently come out with what's called the Media Installer, and this is going forward going to sort of be the one main way to install and work with your printer and paper profiles, especially for Epson Media. So if I double click and open the Epson Media Installer, you can see that it has found the P900, which is connected through the driver and the control panel. So it sees that the printer is attached, and you can see the status not acquired, etc. Okay, all this says is that most of these profiles are not downloaded and not available on my computer. So if I wanted to print, for example, to Velvet Fine Art paper, or print to Fine Art Matte paper, or even Premium Luster, which is like the standard go-to all-in-one kind of paper, I need to download the profiles, okay? And the Media Installer is the place to do that currently, especially for Epson Media. Now, if you're using a third-party paper, it is worth knowing that the printer profiles reside on your hard drive just like any other file. Now, with the newest Epson printer drivers, the profiles are sort of embedded within the driver software system, and they don't display in the same way as old style printer profiles, and especially third-party ones. But if you look, this is the profiles folder in my ColorSync folder, and these are all printer profiles that I have created custom. Now, X-Rite also makes a system that not only will calibrate and profile your monitor, but that can also profile the printer. And so you get a really nice sort of closed loop match between what you see on screen and what comes out of the printer, because the same software system and the same hardware device actually is doing the profiling. I actually have here a printout. This is a Target. I'm not sure. I understand that probably my picture is about this big on your screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see that. This is a Target from the i1 Studio, the i1 Studio system that does the screen calibration as well as printer profiling. And the result of those are these printer profiles that sit on your hard drive. Now, within the color management system, we can actually view these printer profiles and you can see their gamut. Okay, so this is getting a little bit deep into the weeds, as it were, of color management, but I think this is a good illustration to help you understand that different papers have different characteristics in the way that they can reproduce color. And it's really important, depending on the image that you're printing. I mean, look at this one and how far down it goes into these blues and purples. This Hahnemühle paper, this is a Hahnemühle canvas, compared to, for example, this PhotoSpeed FB distinction paper, right? The color gamut is vastly different. So what's important to know about this is that every paper has its certain range of colors that it's capable of reproducing easily. And that's another point of consideration when you're choosing a paper to go with a certain image. Now, there may be some images that have colors like very saturated blues or greens or orange colors that actually are very difficult to reproduce depending on the paper that you're using. So as you get more experience with printing and you look at different media that's available, it's really good to know what is the gamut, what's the color range that that paper or that canvas is actually able to reproduce. Okay, so that's about all we have time for on the color management. But the important thing to keep in mind here, the takeaway is that you've got a color management system in your operating system. It's using printer profiles to translate the color values, and that the profiles that are installed with the driver work in conjunction with the settings to produce your accurate output. Okay, so it is very possible and achievable to get predictable, repeatable results with just those few little steps. Okay, so with that, now we're going to shift gears and we're actually going to set up some print jobs. So I'm going to start in Lightroom for a couple of reasons. Lightroom is a lot easier to print multiple images. Now, if you're just printing one photograph at a time, it might be easier in some cases to maybe print from Photoshop. Because if it's just a single image and you're just printing one size on one sheet of paper, Photoshop works fine for that. But anytime that you're printing multiple images, then Lightroom makes it far easier, because in the Lightroom print module, you have controls over how many photos you want to fit on one page, for example. Okay, so let's say that I wanted to print multiple photos, and I'll just pick some random ones here. There's nothing special of note about these pictures that I'm choosing, other than it's a variety. Okay, so you can see that Lightroom makes it very easy to lay out multiple images on one sheet. Let's make this, I think we'll we'll just set this up as if we were just going to print a bunch of small. Okay, so if we're going to print a bunch of small images all on one page, I know that you wouldn't normally do that. I'll change the settings here in a second. Don't want the photo info. Okay, so again, this is Lightroom in the print module. We've got these multiple images that are sort of what we call ganged up on the page. And you can change the size and the spacing between them. Lightroom provides a whole bunch of different templates that you can print different sizes of each image, and in which case you'd end up with multiple pages in the print job, right? So each image is going to print that many times at those different sizes, right? So Lightroom really gives you all of the controls for printing multiple images on one sheet, or even if you're printing multiple images. Sorry, bear with me. I'm going to go to my templates here. If we are printing multiple images, but only one of a kind, or one on a page, okay, so I've got 8 photos selected, and if I wanted to print all 8 of these to the same size on the same paper, then I can just queue up a multi-image print job, which in Photoshop, you cannot do anything quite like this, okay? In the new Epson print layout, you absolutely can. But up until that software came out, Lightroom was really the best way to print multiple photos at once. So in any software that you're printing from, one of the very first things that you'll do is page setup. And a page setup is going to start by choosing the exact printer. I'll just use number 2, which is the one I just installed. And then you choose your page size. Let's just say I wanted to print it on A3. Okay, so got the correct printer chosen. I've got my paper size. I always try and print in portrait orientation. Now there may be the odd exception where landscape actually works, but most of the time, if you think of portrait as the way that the sheet of paper is feeding through, in almost all cases, your short side is the one that's coming through, right? You're not printing photos in a landscape orientation as they go through the printer. So I try and orient my images on the page as their portrait, even if once they come out, I'm just going to rotate them into landscape, right? So, and that's easy enough to do. You can see that in Lightroom, it's automatically, sorry, bear with me. I'm just going to put on my reading glasses here. The tiny little type. Okay, so, right, so Lightroom shows me we're on A3 paper. Somehow I got the wrong. I think that's just Lightroom not showing the correct printer. So we'll just hide that. We'll pretend that it's the correct one. So we've got A3 paper. We've got each of the photos placed on the sheet. And now at this point, we're going to go down to the print job panel, and actually having a little issue here. Bear with me. This is a Lightroom thing that I've not seen before, but for some reason, Lightroom is not changing to my other printer. Let me try it this way. There we go. Okay, so these info overlays are really handy, especially if you've got multiple printers installed. Because I had that other HP business printer for some reason was sort of stuck in there as being the selected printer, and it was not changing the settings. Okay, so back to the setup. Over on the print job panel, The first thing is to check that it is in fact going to the printer, and I'm going to uncheck draft mode. Okay, that's really crucial because you see that with draft mode printing checked, all of these other options are unavailable. And as draft mode, as it sounds, it's going to come out looking not very good. Okay, so uncheck draft mode. Print resolution, if we want these all to be printed at the same resolution, because right now they're all different sizes and different resolutions to begin with, having this checked will actually render the print job at the same resolution for all of the images. So that's probably a good idea on a job like this where they're all different. Otherwise, you'd end up with each one potentially being spooled at a different resolution. Print sharpening, I would say you always want to apply. Now, Lightroom is pretty smart in the way that the order of processing as it's sending these print jobs, that it's going to resample the files to the correct size at the right resolution and then apply the right amount of sharpening just on low, standard, or high. Right? It's all done very intelligently because it's done in a certain order of operations. And you can choose glossy or matte media for the print sharpening type. Generally speaking, matte would only be for like fine art papers because it's a much heavier level of sharpening. If it's luster paper or glossy, just use glossy. And I usually use a standard amount, standard and glossy for any kind of photo paper. Okay, now here in color management, then we want to make sure that it's actually managed by a profile. And this is where being able to select your printer profile from this list is crucial. And because I didn't install the media installer profile for my paper, it is not going to be visible in here. Okay, but some of the other ones that I did install earlier, I mean, I've installed the P900 probably half a dozen times so far. Some of those are in here. So we've got premium luster. So I'll check that. That's the one that I want. Okay, so you can see that we're working top to bottom through the panel. We've got the correct printer selected in the page setup. Again, page setup is always the starting point. We've selected our paper size and then told Lightroom what resolution and what sharpening to apply. Last but not least, we choose the correct printer profile. And again, it's the printer and the paper together in the profile. And then in most cases, the rendering intent, perceptual, and relative really doesn't make a huge difference in most types of images. That being said, given the choice, I almost always use relative. Apologies, we don't have a lot of time really to get into that too deeply, but I prefer relative rendering intent. That's probably an area where if you can do some small test prints on an image by image basis, you may find that you prefer one over the other, but I prefer relative. Okay, print adjustment, we're not going to use any print adjustment in this case. Okay, so Lightroom is going to queue this job into the print driver using these settings with no extra adjustment to it. Okay, so at this point now, we're ready to print. If I hit the print button, it's just going to queue the job. But if I click printer, now this is where it gets very important in the driver settings. Okay, so make sure again that you've got the correct printer selected. And then working down here, we can just skip all this top bit and go straight to print settings. Okay, and this is where all these settings are going to make the biggest difference to how accurate the print comes out to what you think it should be. So the first thing is on media type. Now, with the P900 and the 700, the newer range of printers, you actually can just set it on the printer control panel. And then the driver will just use whatever is in the printer. So if I put premium luster in, set that on the printer control panel, I can just leave this on printer settings and it'll automatically select the media type. But I'm not a big fan of using sort of automated settings like that anyway. And so I would normally just go ahead, just to be safe, and make sure to choose. So all I've done here is make sure to choose the exact same paper as what I've chosen the profile. I mean, it's that simple. Print quality down here, and here are the options that can vary widely depending on whether you're using the Epson driver or whether you actually have AirPrint installed. So if you're using a Mac and you come in here and you don't have all of these options, it's because you're using AirPrint. Okay, so all of the options now, these things have changed a little bit, as you know, that with the new models of printers, but you can see that the resolution 5760 DPI, much higher than ever possible before. The carbon black is a new feature of the P900 and 700, where it'll lay down additional gray inks and a black treatment to give you really deep, rich blacks with a lot more dynamic range, or a DMAX, I should say. And then if you go to quality options, then this is a little bit more like the old style settings, where you can choose high speed means that it's printing bidirectionally. When that's unchecked, it's only printing one direction. So it'll take twice as long. Finest detail, if I'm printing at the highest resolution, I normally leave that on. If I'm printing at anything sort of lower resolution, for speed, then that you can see that that's grayed out and that's automatically checked anyway. Okay, so you have a lot of options here for quality, and there's actually, at least that I can see, at least 3 or 4 new controls and different levels of options that we have for the P900 and 700 versus, and this is all stuff that's updated in driver software. And that's why it's so important to keep up to date with your drivers, because the driver software also works with the firmware in the printer and can potentially change the options and the controls that you have available. So for the most part, I would say for most print jobs, printing at 1440 is totally adequate, and to your eye, you would never see the difference between 1440 or, in this case, 5760. Now, there could be the exception. It just depends on the image and how much original resolution and how much detail you have to start with. This is an area where you should experiment a little bit, and for certain types of images, see what is the best quality setting that will also produce the fastest output. There is no point going to the highest quality setting and making your print take 2 or 3 times longer if you can't see the difference anyway. Okay, but none of these quality settings here are going to have a material effect on things like color and tone and the overall look of the image, right? This is all down to resolution and how the pixels in the image are actually laid down in ink dots on the paper. Okay, so what's going to control your color is this stuff up here, and making sure just to choose the correct media type. So as long as you've chosen the correct media type and the correct profile, as long as your screen is calibrated and profiled, for the most part, what comes out of the printer is going to look like what it does on screen. Okay, so I'll just cancel out of that. We're not going to queue that one up. In the time that we have left, and I want to make sure to leave some time at the end for Q&A, I'm going to send one of these images over to Photoshop, and I'll show you how I would print it from there. So let's use this one, because this is a good one to show you the effects of sharpening and image resolution. So I'm just going to open this one into Photoshop. Okay, here we are in Photoshop. Now, the process, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is quite different, where Photoshop is really, it's fine for printing one image at a time and for printing one size at a time. But anytime you're thinking multiple images or multiple sizes, Photoshop really isn't ideal. Epson print layout actually would be a better choice. I'm going to save this, and I'll open this one into print layout as well in just a second. Bear with me a second here. Okay, I'm save a copy of that. So in Photoshop, one of the first things that I would always do if I'm printing a landscape-oriented image like this is actually rotate the image 90 degrees. As I said earlier, it's a lot easier to correctly place the image on the sheet of paper, knowing that it's going through, the long direction, even if that means actually rotating the image. I have spent more time than I'd like to admit trying to use the page setup dialog box to rotate a landscape image. So that's just one little tip for you there. So before I open the print dialog box, so let's take a close look at the resolution of this image, which is pretty good. It's pretty sharp. I mean, it was shot handheld at a fairly high ISO. So, I mean, it's not perfect, but it certainly has enough resolution to print at even a very large size and look very, very sharp. Here's zooming in on the pixel details. Okay, so one of the things when you're printing from Photoshop that's really important to do is to size your image to the print size that you want yourself before you actually print the job. It does take a little bit more time. It's an extra step, but it gives you the opportunity to apply a more refined sharpening, and your results will be better than if you let the Photoshop print dialog box do the resampling for you. So let's just say I want to print this, let's say 210, 297, 420 high, make it like an A3 sheet. Whoops, not pixels, 420 millimeters. Okay, and I will set the resolution to 240 pixels per inch. Again, we don't have time really to get too much into why, but that's a nice mapping to the Epson printhead resolution. 240 is kind of our magic number. 360 is another one, but in most cases, total overkill. Okay, so I'm going to use 240, and again, I'm setting the image size to exactly the size that I want to make the print. Now this would come out as a borderless because it's right to the exact edge of an A3 sheet. Okay, so if I click OK, I've now resampled the image to the exact size that I want it printed. But before I would print it, then I would also sorry, I'm having trouble getting to the top of my screen because of the zoom bar. Give me just a second to get this thing out of the way here. There we go. Sorry about that. I was hiding all my menus. Okay, so before sending the print job, then I will apply sharpening, and I'll use unsharp mask. And depending on the image, we'll zoom in a little bit more just so you can see the effect here. I mean, generally, you would expect it to look a little bit more on screen than what you might think you would want, because when that gets translated onto the dither pattern of the inkjet printhead, then that's going to give you the most sharpness. So do you see the difference there? I'll just go a little bit slower. This is with the sharpening, that's without. Okay, so that's kind of the level of edge detail I'd be looking for. And I do use unsharp mask for that. And now I would rotate the image 90 degrees. And now, in my mind, this is ready to print to A3 size. And so this is where I would save a derivative file. And so I would actually call it A3. Right, I would name the file for what it is or what it does. So now I've got my A3 print file. Okay, so here in the Photoshop print dialog box, the first thing I want to do is change it to Photoshop manages colors. And then I need to choose my profile. Again, it's exactly the same as in Lightroom. One little tip, unless your image is 16-bit to start with, there's no point at all using 16-bit data through the Epson print driver. And for that matter, for most images, you wouldn't really see the difference anyway. I've only seen a couple of cases with images with very, very smooth gradients, where this is designed to help eliminate any banding, but most of the time you don't really need this and you won't really see a difference, especially on an image like this. So I wouldn't bother with 16-bit. Again, the rendering intent, I prefer relative, but you can try perceptual. You can ignore these other two, saturation and absolute. Those have no bearing in what we're doing. So it's either relative or perceptual. Always, always, always use black point compensation. That's so important that Lightroom just does away with it because it's just on by default. Okay, so now I've chosen the profile, asking that Photoshop will manage the colors. Then I go into print settings, and here we are again back into the printer driver. And so now if I choose the paper size, we'll just do, it would say A3 borderless retained size because I sized it exactly for A3. Although I didn't get the size quite right. I realize my math isn't so good. Oh no, it should be 420. Okay, borderless is giving 10 extra mil in order for it to bleed. So just understand that you're going to lose 10 millimeters on that short side. And then once again, this is exactly the same as in Lightroom, because again, we're looking in the printer driver now. This is not Photoshop software. This is the printer driver. And so the settings will be exactly the same. And so the important thing is that you choose the correct type of paper, print quality. Maybe we just say high quality. In this case is going to be 1440. Okay, now you want to make sure, if I click advanced color settings, you want to make sure that there's no color management being applied here. This is just telling us, make sure that you're using the right profile and media type, which we are, because this is an easy one. Okay, and that's it. I click save, and now this is ready to print. And you can see in the preview that it's scaled to bleed on the sheet. Okay, so we're going to turn it over for questions now. Apologies that I didn't, actually, before we start questions, I do know that I did not get into soft proofing, and apologies for that. It just, that's a little bit more time consuming. Probably more important is to look at Epson print layout. The new software from Epson allows you to do the same kind of layouts as you would, for example, in Lightroom. You can do multiple images. And it's loading the printer information. Let me load an image. Okay, if I load an image in here, you can see that it gives me the a default layout, but then I can choose my paper size. So again, you choose your printer, choose your media, choose your paper size. Now, if I had multiple images loaded in here, Sorry, I don't, but all the thumbnails show along here, and you can gang them up and you can scroll through and do multi-page jobs. You would allow print layout to use an ICC profile, and you can see it has an option for auto select. Once again, I'm not a big fan of auto selecting things. I may change as things get more intelligent and AI starts taking over printing, but basically that's the setup, right? Again, and it's, you can see by now that the sequence of steps and the settings that you're looking for are always the same. That you're going to want to choose your printer, choose the paper size, choose the correct printer profile, make sure that the printer itself is not doing any color management. And then last but not least, we could set the quality. And so these quality settings are the same as what you would find in the driver. And again, on the P900 and P700, you have the black enhance overcoat and the option for the carbon black as well to improve the rendering of deep solid black colors. So that is Epson print layout. If you've got a recent model Epson printer, I would encourage you to go and download this. You can get it from epson.co.uk and some of the other European Epson websites. But it's a pretty good bit of kit, with the one caveat that, as you probably notice, there's no editing in here. So by the time you're bringing images into Epson print layout, you need to have finished your master file, and these are just to go straight to the printer without any adjustment. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop my screen sharing for the time being, if I can get my controls back up here. Stop sharing. There's my video back, and we're ready for some Q&A.
Before we get onto the Q&As, Nat, there's one from me.
Yeah.
Why do you go for abstract images?
I like abstraction because it leaves the finishing of the viewing the image and the experience of the photograph to the viewer. I'm not trying to tell a story or share a moment in time or document or convey something that happened. I'm trying to get the viewer's imagination going and have a viewer become part of the experience of viewing the work.
Super. Question from Valerie. I have an Epson Stylus Photo 1500W, which I think isn't listed anymore. In this case, can I no longer update the driver?
I'm sorry, but I'm not the best one to ask that. I don't actually work for Epson, so I don't intimately know all of the products and their timelines. Dominic Gurney is the best one to ask that. I would suspect that if you have gone to the epson.co.uk website for that printer, and on each of the printer models has sort of a dedicated page.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you can't find the printer model and a download for a driver, then chances are it is not being updated. Now, there may be a workaround there where sometimes I have found copies of old drivers on the Epson US website, but obviously the options in a US driver are going to be very different than for the UK. But apologies, I don't know that model specifically, but I would suspect if you're having trouble finding it, it may very well have been retired.
Someone's just put on the chat, you can update the SP1500W driver if you go to www.epson.sn.
Oh, so epson.sn has it in there. That's great. Yeah. I was not able to do my 9890 on epson.sn, but I've also been told that epson.sn, as time goes on, they will be incorporating more and more printers into that system, including starting to go further back to the old ones. So even if it may not be on there now, in the future it might be. So I think going forward, Epson.sn should be maybe your first best place to look, because they're trying to make that sort of the hub.
The go-to place.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one from Paul: do you manually adjust brightness and contrast prior to calibration of your screen by use of color/black and white check sheets?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you just read that first part again?
Do you
Oh,
manually?
I see it. I see it here, actually.
You can see it, yeah.
Brightness and contrast, I assume he means on the display itself. Yes. So you need a monitor that has brightness and contrast adjustments, which automatically sort of rules out laptop screens and things like that. But also, if you are in the market for a new monitor, you want a display that not only has separate brightness and contrast adjustment, but you want to be able to adjust the RGB outputs independently as well. And
Yeah.
so before running the measurement cycle on the calibration process, there is a stage where you set the brightness to a certain level, and I usually set mine to 90. And I forget the unit of measurement, but it's CMD2 squared or whatever it is. The recommendation from X-Rite is around 120, which I find is too bright. I used to work at 80 because that is actually more closer to commercial prepress brightnesses, but it's just too dim. It's too dark to work with in most cases. So 90 to 100 is the brightness that you want, and you would set that before running the color patches.
Great. You've stated you'd connect the printer to the computer by USB cable and not Wi-Fi. Why is that?
Stability and reliability. If you think about the way that Wi-Fi works, there is always a chance of some little glitch. I mean, it's radio waves after all. And if you're going from your printer or from your computer to the printer, sending a job, through your router and then to the printer, however remote the chance might be, there could be issues related to the Wi-Fi signal. The other thing is that you could have issues with bandwidth. If somebody else is using, watching Netflix or using the broadband. And last but not least, using a cable is going to give you the fastest and most sort of dedicated throughput. If you use a USB 3 cable, you'll have the fastest speed going directly from your computer to the printer. And it's important to note too that when we're making fine art prints and we're being very careful about our method and our process, you're going to be right next to the printer watching as it's feeding and the printing and as the sheet comes out. And if you're sitting right next to it, then why bother with Wi-Fi anyway? So a USB cable is still the safest bet.
I've got to be honest, even in the office we do that. We don't use Wi-Fi because it can drop out, can't it?
It's a nice idea. I mean, and I have to admit, the P900 was the first printer that I have used the Wi-Fi on just for the fun of it. And after printing like 2 jobs from another room, I thought, this is ridiculous. I mean, I got to be right next to it anyway. And using a lead or using a wire is still the best way.
So how do you take the printer off AirPrint? I have a P600.
I would just reinstall that printer or make a new one. You can if you're on the Mac, I don't recall exactly the steps on Windows, but on a Mac in the system preferences, you can just remove the printer, right? Just delete it out of the list and then click the plus button to re-add it. And then in the process of adding it, then you'll be able to choose again. It's actually hard to switch it once it's already in there, but it's easy enough just to re-add it in there and delete the AirPrint one out of there. But just so to avoid any confusion, I would delete the AirPrint one first and then just re-add the correct one.
Yeah, and re-add it basically.
Yeah.
So any advice on inks? Do you always recommend Epson, or are there any good third-party ones?
Always only Epson inks.
Absolutely.
Um, it's just, I mean, full stop. Enough said. You'll have all kinds of potential problems using anything other than Epson inks. It's just
I've
not
been
worth
there
this.
now, so I've used third party, and they leak basically the
Yeah,
water.
everybody that I've ever talked to who has tried third-party inks always has some reason to regret it later.
Yeah,
So just don't. It's
I think
unfortunate because it looks like you can save a lot of money, but it doesn't work out.
no, in theory it's great, but it doesn't work, does it?
Yeah.
Can you recommend paper for black and white printing, please?
That's a good question. And as we were talking about in that section on papers, it kind of depends on the image, doesn't it? I like it for photo type papers, black and white. I really love Epson traditional photo. Um, the traditional photo paper is a Baryta style of coated fiber-based paper. It's got a really lovely surface sheen to it. It reproduces a lot of different types of images with fantastic detail, and the whiteness of it is nice and neutral. It's not too warm, not too cool. So for photo papers, Epson traditional. For art papers, the Epson fine art papers are fantastic. I'd meant to show I mentioned about the sample packs. Epson has a range of fine art papers in two different shades, sort of bright white and off white, and two different surface textures. And they're really fantastic papers. And they look really, really amazing with nice black and white prints.
Another great question here. I can go a few weeks without using my printer. Should I run some prints in between to keep things moving, or will it be okay? I'm worried about the ink drying out.
Absolutely, you should at least do a nozzle check. I have currently, because I'm borrowing this P900, I have 5 printers to look after at the moment, and I run a nozzle check on every one of them on Fridays, even if I haven't been printing to that machine or even if I don't plan to. And doing a nozzle check really is all it takes, because if you can print a clean nozzle check, you're fine. You don't really need to print test prints or use any more ink and paper. Just use cheap, like recycled copy paper. Like whenever I make a print on, on my business printer, if I, before I throw away a sheet of paper, I'll just stack it up and I keep old discarded paper to use for nozzle checks. And if you do a nozzle check every week, then you should be covered. And you'll also know if you do a nozzle check and it's not perfectly clean, then you know it needs a cleaning cycle.
That's great. Are you on a Mac? And if so, do you use a Mac monitor or a separate monitor?
I'm on a Mac and I use an NEC monitor, but I am very much in the market for one of the new BenQs.
Yeah, I've got a BenQ.
Yeah, they look great. I've always loved the ISOs, but never really could justify the cost. The NEC one I have is 99% Adobe RGB, and I've been really happy with it, but it's getting a few years old now, so I think probably BenQ would be the next place I look.
Yeah, they're good value as well. They're
Yeah,
not ridiculously priced.
yeah, and you can calibrate them very accurately.
They're absolutely superb. They're also, sort of flicker free and all the rest of it that comes with it. They're really good. One from Mark. You mentioned not ticking the 16-bit option for printing unless your image is 16-bit. What would be the consequence if you did?
No consequence. There's just no point to doing it. And it's best to standardize your steps and standardize your workflow so that nothing is checked that shouldn't be and nothing is left unchecked that should be, right? You want to try and get all of the settings exactly right, just as a matter of developing your own skill and your own habit. And if your image is not 16-bit, then don't check the 16-bit box. It's not going to hurt anything, but it's more a matter of thought process because, as time goes on, you want to be paying attention to that stuff. And sometimes printing in 16-bit can make a big difference. Now, I say that with one slight little caveat that I had an issue a couple of years ago now where I was actually trying to print in 16-bit. So, I mean, the images were 16-bit to begin with, but having the 16-bit box checked was producing horrible output, and it was because my driver had become corrupted. Whereas when I had the 16-bit box unchecked and it was just printing 8-bit, the images looked fine. So I guess the point there is that a checkbox in the driver potentially is doing something. It's affecting the pipeline. And if you don't need it, don't use it.
Yeah. If you don't, like you say, if you don't need it, don't use it.
Yeah.
One from Ian. What color gamut is best to use? sRGB or Adobe RGB?
Adobe RGB for printing inkjet like we're talking about. sRGB is perfect for uploading to the web and for viewing on screen. sRGB is also fine for having lab prints made, like C prints, like chromogenic C-type prints can be fine with sRGB. But for if you're doing inkjet printing, for high quality fine art prints, then Adobe RGB all the way.
Yeah. One from Cliff. Brightness and contrast sliders in Lightroom print module. Should they be used, or does it just mean the setup isn't correct?
That's a bit of a loaded question. I would say that there are better methods, if only that you cannot see the effect on screen, right? That you can adjust those, and I'm assuming he's talking about brightness and contrast in the print module specifically, where you can actually sort of lighten up prints and increase the contrast just on the output. But you get no on-screen preview for that. So it's really hit and miss, trial and error. If your screen is properly calibrated and you're using good profiles and your driver settings are correct, then you shouldn't really need to use those adjustments. If you have images that you're not able to get the result you want with the paper you want, then that's where soft proofing comes in. And viewing the image on screen with a simulation of how it would look with that profile, that allows you to make more refined adjustments using a derivative file, where in Lightroom, for example, you would use a virtual copy with a soft proof. And if you have Lightroom, I'd encourage you to look at the soft proofing and learn a little bit about how that works in Lightroom, because the virtual copies you can make in Lightroom are really, really perfectly suited for soft proofing, and then you can make slight adjustments specifically based on what you can see on screen.
Good advice. There's one final question from Paul. In the printer module, you didn't uncheck resample image when resizing. What's the difference?
Again, I think that I'm assuming we're talking Lightroom. The print panel in the print module in Lightroom, resample image, if it's unchecked, it will send the file to the printer queue without changing the resolution. If you check it, then it will use the resolution that you put in that text field. So I had put 240 pixels per inch, because remember I was queuing up like 8 images and they were all different sizes and resolutions. So I wanted them all to print at 240, in which case you have to check that box in order for them to be resampled. If that box is unchecked, then Lightroom will send all the images to the queue at whatever size, whatever resolution they end up being at that size. And in some cases, they might be lower resolution than what you want. And in other cases, they might be much higher than what you need.
Well, Nat, loads of positive feedback in the chat.
Brilliant.
Great session, learned so much. Thank you, enjoyed the webinar, all very interesting, etc., etc. But
good. Okay. Well, I really enjoyed it too. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more to say about this stuff. It's a little tough to compress it down into 90 minutes or so. And I do want to remind everyone that I do teach this stuff both in in group sessions and one-on-one. And I did want to mention also, before we go, one final thanks to Epson, for supporting me in all of this, and for asking me to come. And I want to invite everyone to an online conference that we're hosting in April. Here's the web address, artphotoconference.com. And we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers, and certainly we'll be talking quite a lot about printing as well. And that's my gallery in Leamington Spa is at photique.uk.
So how do people contact you personally if you want more advice?
My website's just natcoalson.com, and that's the best way to reach me through there. And I'm happy to be contacted and communicate one-to-one.
So if people say they've seen you on here, they just get in touch right there.
Yeah, I'm easy to find online. I mean, and if you didn't jot down any of these addresses, I mean, just a quick Google search and you can find me, or through social media as well.
Superb. We've got no more questions, so can I just thank you for your time, because it's been
You're very welcome. Thank you for your time, and thanks to everybody for participating. I really appreciate everybody who's come tonight.
and loads of positive response. That's absolutely brilliant.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I'll say goodnight then. Thank you so much.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of your evenings.
You too.
And stay safe.
Cheers. Bye. Stay healthy.